Energy. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is an initiative of the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, or better known as ACCEP. And we would like to say thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Norway, who is our donor for this project. So it is my pleasure to be the moderator for this sharing session. And I'm so glad that currently we have more than 100 that joining us from around the world. And then we are connected together through this webinar. So welcome all. And without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Nuki Arya Utama, our Executive Director, to deliver his welcoming speech. So please, Dr. Nuki, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Hoyen Chan. Very good morning and also good afternoon over here. Mr. Hars, Vijay Singh, for you, Project Lead Energy Transition, World Economic Forum. Also, Luis Anderson. My pronunciation is correct. Good morning. Electricity Industry Lead, I think. Yeah. And all participants, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues from ACE. On behalf of ASEAN Center for Energy, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the ASEP sharing session series on energy transition and the cyber challenge of future energy system. I wish to express my appreciation and thanks to the World Economic Forums for sharing perspectives and insight with us. It is indeed an honor for us to be able to host this sharing session. This event is organized under the initiative of ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, we call it ASEP, which is funded by the Norwegian government. Besides knowledge sharing and raising awareness through sharing sessions, ASEP is also active in publishing policy briefs, articles, and academic papers related to energy and climate change. These are all available from ACE and ASEP websites. So please serve in our website. Ladies and gentlemen, the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC blueprint, tackles the need for sustainable energy and energy transitions towards sustainable development as one of the AEC Project Economic Deliverability in 2020. And this will be achieved under the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, or APAC, a 10-year platform starting from 2016 to 2025, which we are currently at the final year of the phase 1 and coming to the second phase. Quite interesting for the APAC phase 2 that we add a sub-theme, which is accelerating energy transition and strengthening energy resilience through greater innovation and cooperation. So it is quite important for us for the next phase to focusing also on the greater innovation on energy transition. Dear all, ladies and gentlemen, digital technologies nowadays are closely connected to our daily activities and affecting our way of life. So as our future energy system, digitalization will be the revolutionary enablers for the energy transitions. And of course, it will be increase the efficiency of the energy supply. It will be interesting to know what are the impacts of the digital technologies on energy demand and how digital tools will improve the operation of energy supply that will create a highly interconnected energy system. So I believe that in the future, besides sharing insight, there are many potential ways for ACE to collaborate with WEF that would benefit for the ASEAN community. Currently, from our registration record, the participation ranges over a variety of sectors, including the government agencies, industries, and academy. And I hope the sharing session will provide insight in policy making, business development, or even the technology and research development pertaining to the energy transition and cyber challenges of the future energy system. Once again, I would like to sincerely thanks to the World Economic Forum and all participants for your support. And last but not least, I hope you will enjoy this sharing session and wish you all a good health held during this pandemic. Thank you. Back to you, Hoyan.
Sorry, Hoyan, Dr. Hoyan, I think you are muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you, Dr. Nuki, for enlightening us the ASEAN Energy Cooperation and the regional energy transition targets. So next, I would like to just give an audience about our flow of today's agenda. So we have done the welcoming remarks. So now the following agenda will be two different topic presentation, and then after the second topic presentation we will have the Q&A together. So today we have two delegates from the World Economic Forum. But then, okay, so before I proceed, I just would like to have a very brief instruction about the Q&A session, so that while we have the while we are listening to the speaker, meanwhile you can already post the question. So we will only allow the question in written form, and you may type and send the question via the GoToWebinar function. And then it also will be very helpful if you could start your question addressed to who, for example, to Harsh or to Luis. Then it will be easier for us to recognize which question to whom. And then another reminder is, if possible, just keep the question short and simple whenever possible, right? Okay, so let's move on. So now, before moving to the presentation, we would like to invite all of you to participate in a poll question. So, Rika? Please rate the progress of the energy transition in your country. So you have 1 minute to answer. Right. Rika?
Okay, do you want to close it now?
Yeah. Okay. So this is the result. So we have the majority of the participants thought that it is progressive. However, more rapid progress is needed. So for this poll result, I will not give any further comment on this, but instead, I will let you find out the answer from our speaker. So ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Harsh Vijay Singh. So Mr. Harsh is a project lead at the World Economic Forum, where he leads research, thought, leadership and stakeholder engagement for a global program to accelerate the energy transition. He has an interdisciplinary background with more than 10 years experience in the energy sector, including as a strategic marketing manager for the South Asia region at the GE Power, and he also was an empirical policy researcher at the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab to work in industry energy efficiency related project and to develop the off-grid electrification business models at Harsh Power System in India. So today, Harsh is going to share with us the insights from Energy Transition Index 2020. So Harsh, please inspire us the energy transition progress and the achievement from our countries. Thank you. So Harsh.
Thank you, Dr. Huyan. I hope we don't have any audio and video challenges. Is my voice audible, Dr. Huyan?
Yeah, now it's clear.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. It was an interesting poll question. Maybe we'll get back to that soon. Rika, can we go to the next slide? So today I'll be covering a few topics. First of all, defining the complexity and trade-offs that are inherent in energy transition, and also sharing insights on the Energy Transition Index, an exercise that we undertake at the World Economic Forum, what it means globally as well as what it means for ASEAN. And we will briefly conclude with the implications of COVID-19 on energy transition. Next slide, please. Next. To just set the background of where we are coming from, I'm not sure how aware are the participants about the World Economic Forum. We are an international organization for public-private collaboration based out of Geneva, Switzerland. We provide a platform for collaborative action on a diverse range of issues, such as climate change, water, oceans, plastics, gender equality, competitiveness, and the likes. And we, in our organization, give space to a number of platforms segmented by industries, regions, as well as issues. And Luis and I, we represent the platform on shaping the future of energy and materials. Next slide, please. A little bit about the platform on energy and materials. We feature collaborative initiatives and discussion on issues that are of critical importance to the global energy system. And this looks at issues which are across geographies, across fuel sources, across technologies, and across stakeholder groups, which is why most of our initiatives, they are led by stakeholders from public sector as well as private sector. And they come from all different parts of the very complex energy system. Some of you might have heard or known about the World Economic Forum through our annual meeting that happens at Davos in January every year. But we also showcase or provide our platform for a number of other initiatives, which is on the next slide, please. So in the energy platform or the energy and materials platform at the World Economic Forum, we are structured by a number of parallel work streams. So as you can see here on screen, the issues range from energy and materials business resilience to materials value and productivity, systemic efficiency on optimizing the energy consumption, innovation, and lastly, country transition and benchmarking. And today's discussion actually fits in two of these initiatives, which you may be able to see on the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll be covering the Global Energy Transition Index, which is a part of the Country Transition and Benchmarking initiative of our platform. And Luis will cover the Systems of Cyber Resilience, which is one of the issues in the energy and materials business resilience challenge in the energy platform. So that completes the introduction. The key here is that the World Economic Forum is a neutral platform. It's a multi-stakeholder platform. We operate in many different regions across the world, and most of our initiatives are forward-looking. They dealing with the challenges that might be coming up in near future. And one of those, as you might be very well aware, is the challenge on energy transition. So let's spend a couple of minutes on trying to understand what exactly does this challenge mean, and why is it, first of all, so challenging to define it in the first place. Can we go to the next slide? So there are as many definitions of energy transition as probably there are analysts, and depending upon where the analyst is coming from, their background, country-specific circumstances, industry affiliations, you might find a lot of different parallel narratives of energy transition. For example, for a developed country, it might be different as opposed to a developing country. For an exporting country, it might be different as opposed to an importing country. It also differs based on what the economic structure of the country is, or what the socio-economic development priorities are. So in some cases, energy transition finds more focus on, let's say, the issue of access. In some countries, it's an issue that is primarily about environmental sustainability. In some cases, energy transition is also about making sure economic growth and government revenue gets suitable boost from the energy sector. And some of those countries are also part of the ASEAN member states, as you might be very well aware. So, which is why it is very challenging to define a uniform, consistent, and a global narrative for energy transition. And it means different things for different stakeholders. But here, as you see on screen, the definition that we have chosen is a general purpose definition, which does not, which attempts to maybe try and establish a common understanding. So we emphasize that energy transition requires a transition to a sustainable, affordable, and a secure global energy system that provides solutions to some of the biggest challenges that the energy system faces. Some of them are climate change, energy access, inclusive development, and some more, which we will discover today. And the key is that this transition needs to be timely. We have a time limit, that whether you time itself by Paris Agreement or by 2100. So we have a time limit, so the transition should be delivered in before the deadline, so to speak. And also, it must be balanced, because energy system, as you know, is a very critical part of all of the modern economy and the society. So energy transition must try and deliver on the objectives while maintaining the balance, so that we do not face disruptions due to lack of demand or oversupply or lack of technology, etc., etc. So I understand this is a little bit complicated. Let's see if we can simplify in the next few slides. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I mentioned the trade-offs that are required in energy transition. So let's spend a minute or two to just understand that why is it complicated? Why is it not just as simple as replacing technologies or replacing fuel sources or investing in a certain part of the energy sector? So first of all, as you see here on the graph, this shows over a period of time the evolution of certain countries' per capita GDP with their per capita energy consumption. And the different colors represent different countries over a period of time. The timeline here is 30 years, between 1970 and 2030, 40 years, sorry. So as you see, most of the countries, the energy consumption has increased with the increase in per capita GDP. And this has been increasing at a diminishing rate. So it's not to say that the future will be a mirror of the past, but this does tell you that the way we have pursued economic growth has been fueled by more energy consumption. So this is the first complexity, that do we need less of energy or more of energy? Given that a lot of countries are still in the early phases of their economic development, that means in some cases, for some countries, they're going to have to use more energy. So that's the first part. Can we go to the next slide? Second part is what we very well know, the challenge of climate change. And that manifests in many different forms. The effects are very palpable. For example, extreme weather disrupted food ecosystems and food supply, air pollution, water-related challenges, and also now more than ever the demand by younger generation for faster and more decisive action. So these are some of the effects that we are seeing from climate change, and the energy system contributes 2/3 to the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. And on the right side here, we see the carbon budget that is remaining. And so this is the challenge from the environmental sustainability perspective that the energy system faces, is that we have only a very limited amount, perhaps less than 25% of the CO2 budget that we can emit or we can add to the atmosphere. The rest of all has already been spent. So this represents the second part of the challenge, that you need technologies that can supply energy needs to eternity, but should not add more than a fixed amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Whether that requires super clean technologies or carbon removal technologies, that's a different question. Next slide, please. And the third part is the part on inclusiveness. Some countries have fossil fuel subsidies that make the energy services more affordable, and because it is also a necessity for daily lives. As a matter of fact, the global fossil fuel subsidies are more than the total subsidies for renewable energy, electric vehicles, and the revenue from carbon taxes combined. And many countries have tried to reduce the subsidies, but that has not always ended well. We see on the screen, you might see some of the countries in the past 1 or 2 years where efforts on removing subsidies were met with violent protests in countries across the world. So it is not as straightforward as just removing subsidies to incentivize renewable energy, because it affects the bottom line of the households, because energy is a part of their daily expenditures. So this is also a complexity that policymakers need to look. So past 3 things that I mentioned, the one about income growth and GDP, the one about environmental sustainability, and the one about inclusiveness and affordability. This is what shows you how complex it is for a policymaker or a decision maker to balance their efforts on energy transition. There may not be a simple or a straightforward solution that ticks all the boxes, but perhaps the way out here is to pursue a wide range of solutions that address all of these 3 priorities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so let's, without further ado, let's jump into the Energy Transition Index. Building up on the discussion or the intro to the challenge of energy transition that I just defined, that is what we use to benchmark countries. And on the screen before you is a part of that framework that we use. So first part is about system performance imperatives, which is the energy triangle that we call. And this is to look at how countries are performing today based on the 3 key objectives that the energy system is expected to serve in a country. First of all, it should be secure. Energy supply should be secure. There should be universal access. Second, it should improve environmental sustainability. And third, but not the least, it should support in the country's economic development and growth. So when we say current system performance, it is to quantify with metrics that on these 3 things, how is a country's energy system positioned today. But we very well know that energy transition is about the future. It represents a movement from the current energy system to a future energy system. And this movement or this future transition that requires a certain amount of enablers to be in place in a country. And those are the enablers that we define as the readiness. Next slide, please. So these are a few what by our understanding a framework for assessing a country's readiness for energy transition. When we say readiness, we mean how is the country's regulatory, institutional, macroeconomic, social, and financial environment set up to support energy system. And this is important because energy transition is a systemic shift. It is not a shift in just technology or fuel sources. It impacts the way politicians make decisions. It impacts the way businesses make investments. It also impacts the way we lead our daily lives, because energy is ingrained everywhere, which is why for energy transition, the boundaries are not limited to the boundaries of the energy system. It is over into the regulatory system, the capital and investment environment, the human capital, consumer participation, etc. And these are the enablers that may not be under the direct responsibility of energy policymakers or energy companies, but they nevertheless affect the speed of energy transition. So the better a country is positioned with respect to these enablers, the faster and more effective will their energy transition be. So that is our hypothesis with which we design the Energy Transition Index. Next slide, please. And we have been doing the Energy Transition Index for quite a few years now. In its previous avatar, the ETI was used to exist as the Energy Architecture Performance Index, and that we did for a good number of years. And since 2018, we revised the framework, which is when we added the readiness component. And this year in May, we launched the third edition of the Energy Transition Index. But as far as the World Economic Forum's benchmarking of energy system goes, so we have a longer history with respect to that. And our index covers 115 countries. I understand that there are more than 250 legal entities, legal national entities in the world. But when we do an index like this, it's very important for us to have data that is consistent across countries, that has got time series, that we can obtain year after year, has a good amount of coverage. So even the 115 countries that we monitor, they cover 90% of the global population, 93% of the global total primary energy supply, and 98% of the global GDP. So we have fair degree of confidence that the ETI provides a good snapshot of what the global progress on energy transition is like. Next slide, please. So without further ado, let's jump into some of the insights. In this section, I will cover the global highlights from the Energy Transition Index. And given the paucity of time, I may not be able to go either deep into any of some of these insights or to cover all of the insights that we discovered. So I would still encourage you to read online where the report and the data, everything is available for public consumption. First thing that we observed this year upon analysis of past 5 or 6 years of data is that 94 out of 115 countries registered an improve in their energy transition index scores over the past 5 years, and which is great. And that is more than 80% of the countries, they have moved positively in the positive direction for energy transition. And this shows you that there is a lot of consensus on what the lot of consensus among different countries on the need, the urgency, and the priorities needed for energy transition. So it's not a coincidence that an index measures that benchmark countries finds 95%, 80% of them have moved in the same direction. There should be a lot of collaboration going on around them as well. There are a few cases of concern which are either representing lack of movement or stagnant movement. Some of the noteworthies are United States, Canada, Brazil, which are large energy consumers, in the Middle East, Iran, and a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So this overall, I would say, is a positive development. Can you go to the next slide? The top ranking countries on this year's ETI mostly come from Western and Northern Europe. So Sweden takes the first rank, followed by Switzerland. United Kingdom and France are the only large countries or large economies in the top 10, and which is a challenge because it's good that countries which are at the top have been able to be at that spot, but if they do not amount to a large amount of the global energy supply or consumption, then that does not mean that the world overall is progressing. So the key thing about the top 10 is that the countries in this list have been more or less consistent over the past 5 or 6 years. And second part is that the scores of these countries has also been more or less consistent. As a matter of fact, the average score of top 10 countries on the ETI over the past 5 or 6 years has moved only a little. The top 10 countries combined have less than 5% of the global primary energy supply, less than 2.6% of global population. So for a majority of the world, that's where the real action will happen in future. Next slide, please. I mentioned that top 10 countries have moved only a little. So as a matter of fact, you see the first bar here says what has been the change in the average ETI scores of top 10 countries since 2015. So the change has been 0.8%. But the rest of the countries have been catching up fast, especially when you look at the emerging and developing Asia region, emerging and developing Europe region, and to some extent sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America region. So the gap in between the top 10 and the rest of the countries is closing, and that is good news as well as bad news. It is good news that emerging economies which consume a lot of energy and where most of the growth in energy consumption is going to come from in future, they are catching up and they are moving faster in energy transition. But it's a bad news, because top 10 countries or the top countries have a very important role to play in establishing best practices that other countries also learn from. And it might be an indication that for the top countries, the ceiling from incremental policies or incremental technologies might be approaching fast, and there is need for some transformative breakthrough solution to unlock the next substantial progress in energy transition. So that's why it's a mixed kind of an insight here. So there is opportunity as well as challenge. Next slide, please. Moving on from the top 10, let's look at some of the countries which are the biggest economies in the world. So here on the slide, you see the G20 countries. The areas represent their share of the global total energy supply. For example, China, as you know, has over 20% of the, or around 20% of the global energy supply or demand, whichever way you look at it. But combined, the G20 countries contribute to 75% of the world's energy. And the color shades here represent their ranks on the ETI. So United Kingdom and France, as you see, have darker shade, which means they have better ranking. But then countries such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, India, China, they have middle performance. So among the largest countries in the world, the progress is uneven. And there is a need for some learning among these countries as well, and that's also an opportunity for collaboration. Because if combined, these countries consume 75% of the world's energy, then as an entity, if G20 were to make collective progress, that would mean that energy transition progress would be more or less guaranteed. Next slide, please. Let's look at some of the key enablers that we found in our analysis. And of course, it's the slide here simplifies this a lot, and each and every one of these would probably require a lot of discussion. But among the countries that were either better performing or fast improving, we saw a few uniform characteristics. So first is on strong political commitment, and this materializes not just in the form of bold policy measures, for example, in the UK and Sweden, but also in the bets that the private sector feels confident to take. So if you were following the news in the last 1 year only, we have seen many bold announcements from private sector. Some of the world's largest asset management firms imbibe the ESG principles. Some of the world's largest companies, both from supply side and demand side, adopted net zero targets. So we see movement happening because of strong political commitment, both on policy side as well on the private sector side. Second is on better access to capital. So countries that are either fast improving or better performing, there is more amount of capital available, and that means that there is an enabling environment in those countries that enables this capital to sustain and grow. So, for example, my own country, India, is a good example. They have had increasing inflows of capital both from domestic and international sources over the past few years. Renewable energy technologies are more or less solid asset class now, and there are more new and innovative financial instruments. And as I mentioned before, a trend that we observe that has been mainstream as actually in the past 2 years is on the ESG. So you have more investors, financial institutions considering, and also some of the largest pension funds that owns good amount of assets. They are considering their carbon exposure and looking at how and where they make investments. And lastly, improving energy intensity. So this is also some of a common characteristic of better performing countries. And there are a variety of ways to achieve that. For example, through process automation, digitalization, and also adoption of energy efficient alternatives. So this is about the past. That what have some countries been doing, to improve their performance. But where is the next wave of growth going to come from? And there are a few opportunities or low-hanging fruits, so to speak. One is on pursuing innovations that can offer breakthrough growth as opposed to incremental growth. Second is on decoupling economic growth, and this is a little bit complex because it requires countries to rethink the way they plan their economic growth, so that it is more sophisticated. It banks more on a high value add sector, which also allow the human capital to enrich their skills to participate in that economy. And a certain diversified economy would have less dependence on energy consumption. Next is to broaden the scope of net zero targets. This is a very positive development, but targets, if they remain on paper, don't really mean a lot. So these net zero targets need a better roadmap. Finally, there are a few key insights. I'll not go into depth on these. I would encourage the audience to read our report, but few highlights are, for example, the net energy importing countries are improving faster than net energy exporting countries. Number two, energy subsidies. There has been overall an improvement. That means reduction in energy subsidies. However, the externalities remain pertaining to energy consumption remain unpriced. Third, household energy expenditure. This is a problem more for developed countries where household electricity tariffs are a significant component of their household expenditure, and that signals an affordability issue. Fourth, natural gas. Great, it's contributed to a good amount of emissions reduction, specifically in the US and EU, by replacing power generation from coal. But methane emissions from natural gas emissions is also production is a key concern. And if you have followed the news in the last week or so, it's proving to be true as more and more shale gas operators in the United States are going bankrupt. The the methane emissions from those facilities are not being checked, and that's a cost that ultimately the taxpayer will have to pay. And finally, on energy access, I think last 20 years there has been tremendous progress in energy access, specifically in Southeast Asia and India. But the next wave of energy access should be looking at access to energy-enabled services, both in household, community, and industrial applications. And also looking at not just energy access as a binary measure as yes or no, but what 5 kinds of energy do they have access to? What different fuels or what different forms of energy, electricity, gas, liquid forms. So that's the next phase of energy access in our opinion. So I think I've spoken a lot about the global heights. We should move to the next section, which is on ASEAN. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you the ranking, and on the y-axis, the scores of ASEAN economies on the ETI. Singapore is the highest ranking energy Asian country on the ETI, ranked 13th. The largest energy consumers in the region, like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, so their performances are more or less comparable. And I would apologize to our audience from Myanmar and Laos. We did not have good amount of coverage of indicators from Myanmar and Laos, which is why they are not a part of this index. So we have 8 ASEAN member states, which you see on screen here, the orange bars. The average ASEAN member state ETI score is more or less similar to the global average, which is around 55%. It's not shown in this graph, but it's around 55%. So let's go to the next slide. A look at the performance of ASEAN countries versus 3 key groups, or comparison in 3 key different aspects. First is, how does ASEAN compares itself with itself 5 years ago, 6 years ago? So in the graph you see the orange line is ASEAN average score on these dimensions for 2020, and the shaded blue part is average ASEAN scores in ETI 2015 for these dimensions. So we see that there has been tremendous progress on energy access and security, and you might agree with this given the amount of progress that was made on energy access in Indonesia, in Cambodia, and in Philippines. On the readiness side, there is a little bit of a challenge. The indicators are similarly scored as 5 years ago, except for a little bit of progress that we saw on capital and investment. And when we say capital and investments, it measures a couple of things. One, it is the access to capital, and second, it's on how much amount of new investment is flowing into renewable energy, energy efficiency, and the likes. And it also looks at the country's credit rating. So that is what we mean by capital investment, which is the dimension on readiness where ASEAN countries on an average have noticed a little bit of an improvement. Next slide, please. Next is comparing ASEAN countries with developing economies globally. And we see that ASEAN countries on an average outperform developing economies average score on almost all of the dimensions here. On on the system performance side, which is the triangle here, ASEAN countries have scored substantially higher on energy access and security and environmental sustainability. And on readiness side, which is the hexagon, things such as infrastructure and innovative business environment, and regulations and political commitment, as well as institutional framework. So ASEAN countries outperform the on an average developing economies globally on these key dimensions. Next slide, please. However, when we compare ASEAN countries with the average score of advanced economies, this is where we see some of the opportunities for improvement. On the system performance side, which is the triangle, we see improvement opportunities on economic development and growth. And then by this dimension, we mean issues, as I mentioned before, issues such as affordability, subsidies, the contribution of energy sector to the country's economic growth in form of exports, imports, or jobs. On the readiness side, ASEAN countries on an average score better on energy system structure. What do we mean by energy system structure? It represents how suitable is the energy infrastructure or the system that is built today to help in energy transition. The more mature or the more lock-in that the energy system has in past technologies, the harder it will be to transition, because it creates an inertia in the system to transition. Since the energy system in ASEAN is developing, because demand is still growing, you have new installations are coming up. So this is an opportunity to build well, so that it creates a good kind of a lock-in, which is future-proof. But in more mature economies, which have decades of inbuilt infrastructure, it is going to be harder for them to transition, because that represents vested interests and stranded assets, which is a very tricky issue to deal. So on energy system structure, ASEAN countries on an average score better. However, there is improvement opportunities on all of the other readiness dimensions: capital investment, regulations, institutions, etc., etc. So when benchmarked to advanced economies, we see the improvement potential for ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. And finally, on this slide, we'll look at the relative positioning of ASEAN countries. And once again, there are only 8. Apologies to our colleagues from Myanmar and Laos. We look at the relative positioning on system performance and transition readiness. So on the y-axis, we have system performance. On the x-axis, we have transition readiness. So as you see, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they are in the top right quadrant. This we classify as leading countries, which have above average system performance score and above average transition readiness score. Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, they have more above average system performance, but they are lagging a little bit in terms of readiness. So there is improvement, but it also represents opportunities. And one of the key trends that you might see on this graph is that the best fit curve would be upward sloping. That means higher score on transition readiness is associated with higher score on an average on system performance. So for a good example of this is Thailand, as a matter of fact. 5 years ago, Thailand used to be on the bottom left quadrant, the emerging countries quadrant. But since it has moved into the leading countries quadrant because it made progress as per our metrics on both system performance and transition readiness. So this is an example of a country that has been doing good on energy transition, at least following the preferred roadmap, which can hopefully lead to an effective energy transition in the future. This is, of course, hypothesis, and it varies by country-specific circumstances. What may be working well for Thailand, that might not be true for Vietnam or Philippines. They would have to find out their own solutions. So that concludes the highlights on ASEAN. I'll quickly like to conclude with a few remarks on what's going on right now. Because as you very well know, COVID-19 has impacted more or less each and every sector, and energy sector is not immune to that. And the imbalances have been experienced in different parts of the industry. With respect to demand, it's been a historic demand reduction in a very short time, by some estimates around 30%. That is both for electricity and oil and gas. And it's led to unprecedented geopolitical maneuvers. When we saw the action by OPEC plus countries on limiting production, that was a collaboration that was not seen before. When countries which were used to compete chose to collaborate. On emissions, it has been overwhelmingly positive. Even in my country, like in Delhi, people were able to see the clean skies for the first time in like decades. And that has been a very welcome change. But by some experts' estimates, that is not something which is going to last. And the experience on previous crises teaches us is that the post-crisis recovery leads to a spike in emissions. So they may or may not be the case this time all over again. And next slide. So how is the COVID-19 versus energy transition story going to end? And the question is, it depends. None of us has seen this kind of a situation before, so we can only offer hypotheses. But one thing that we can say for certain is that there are opportunities and challenges. So let me enumerate quite a few. So on economic growth, it can the economic stimulus measures that have been taken by many countries. Some of those countries have had green strings attached, whether for supply or for demand sides, for example, for airlines, and represents an opportunity for energy transition. But it's also a challenge because the amount of jobs that have been affected by this in the energy sector, that represents a challenge to economic growth. Data is not updated for that, but at least from what I read for the United States, there were around 3 million jobs in the energy sector, including clean energy and fossil fuels, that have been impacted by this. Second is on affordability. So due to demand erosion, energy prices are low. They went negative for a short time, but overall they have been low. They are still low in the mid-40s. But it's also a challenge because in some countries, governments are increasing fuel taxes to finance their stimulus. So the low energy prices are not necessarily being passed on to the consumers because the economic stimulus resources, they need to come, the governments need to raise these funds, and fuel taxes, excise duties, they have been one of the sources by which governments are taking them. And these might be sticky in the long term, which represents a challenge for affordability. Similarly, there are some other issues. I will not go in detail except for the last one, which is the consumer aptitude. So we are all working remotely. As a matter of fact, this is the first time I've been in my office in 4 months. It might be the case for some of you as well. And this represents an opportunity in energy transition, that it makes us shift in the way we lead our lives, and that can be the push needed for us to also consume energy differently. But this also is a challenge, because let's use a public transportation, for example. It means more use of private transportation. And the digital devices and the backing infrastructure, data centers in particular, they are also an increasing share of energy consumption. So if most of the world were to move online, then we may just be supplementing or replacing one form of energy consumption with the next. So that's also a mixed bag. So that finishes my presentation. I hope you have had some information, and I'll hand it back to Hoyen. And I see there are some questions in the chat box. I'll try to answer them to the best I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harsh. This is very informative, and I believe that the audience will have more questions to ask. So please start to ask the question if you have anyone. So let's move on to the next topic. So likewise, before we continue, we would like to once again invite you to participate in another poll question. Do you believe your organization is doing enough to ensure the cyber resilience of our critical energy infrastructure? So you have a minute to answer. Right. Thank you. And now we see the result. All right, we have two answers that about the same. One is mostly, while cyber resilience is not a top priority. And the other one is not really. I joined discussion on cyber resilience. The next one, the next agenda will be, let me introduce our next speaker, and she will definitely comment on this result. So the next speaker is Ms. Louise Anderson, and she has been leading the electricity industry within the World Economic Forum since 2017. She has been leading the system of cyber resilience for electricity community since its inauguration in the 2018. And before that, she gained experience across the electricity value chain, from the power generation to transmission of the European electricity market. So her topic for today's sharing session is enhancing the cyber resilience of critical electricity infrastructure. So Louise, we are ready to learn from you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Hoyen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, good.
You can, great. Okay, so my role is leading the electricity industry, and one of my focus areas, as Hoyen mentioned, is today's topic, cyber resilience of critical electricity infrastructure. So I'm going to try and keep you entertained for maybe 20 minutes or so, and we'll leave some time for questions. My presentation is going to be split into 3 separate sections. First, I'm going to share some examples of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. Next, I'm going to speak about the World Economic Forum Systems of Cyber Resilience Electricity Community. And finally, I'll share some recommendations our community has developed over the past 2 years at the international, national, and organizational levels. I would like you to take from this presentation a sense of urgency, a sense that we all need to act now together to ensure the resilience of our power systems. And that's, I think, really reflected in the poll that we just did, which is, probably the majority of people are saying that, not really or no in terms of the focus on cyber resilience in your organization. So with that, we'll start with a short 90-second video. Rika, could you press play, please? Fingers crossed that it works. So, Rika, if you could flick to the third slide, please, I'll continue the presentation. So the next couple of slides further emphasize, just back one more, please. The next couple of slides further emphasize that we cannot be relaxed about this topic. The slide you're looking at right now picks out only a handful of the cyber attacks on critical electricity infrastructure over the past 10 years. I'm going to just talk about two. So of course, the Stuxnet example is included here. And it was believed that up until Stuxnet, all cyber attacks focused on data, whereas Stuxnet, for the first time, focused on assets, physical assets, critical infrastructure. Stuxnet is a malicious computer worm, which was discovered in 2010, after it degraded an estimated 1,000 centrifuges in Iran's Natanz nuclear facility by modifying their rotation speed and causing them to spin out of control. The worm specifically targets particular PLCs, or programmable logic controllers, which allow the automation of electromechanical processes, such as those to control machinery and industrial processes. Another example on this slide is InDestroyer, or crash override. And as you saw in the video just a few minutes ago, it was a piece of malware used to attack the Ukrainian electric utility in 2016. This malicious code was purpose-built to disrupt physical systems, our critical infrastructure. And instead of physically accessing the Ukrainian utilities' electrical substations and manually switching off power, as the hackers did in 2015, the 2016 attack was fully automated. It was programmed to include the ability to speak directly to grid equipment, sending commands to switch the flow of power on and off, meaning that crash override could perform blackout attacks more quickly with far less preparation and with far fewer humans managing it. So really what I want to stress here is that cyber attacks are increasing in frequency, but not only that, they're increasing in terms of complexity and sophistication. Next slide, please. So while folks originally believed that Stuxnet was the first cyber attack on physical assets, it turns out that a mysterious explosion on a pipeline in Turkey in 2008 was actually the first cyber attack in the public discourse targeting the manipulation of assets. Majority owned by BP, this pipeline was actually built to be one of the most secure in the world. Next slide, please. However, the pipeline was no match for the digital intruders who gained entry to the pipeline control systems, and they did that through poorly secured video surveillance cameras, allowing them to tamper with the system by shutting down alarms and cutting communications. After that, they were able to super pressurize the crude oil in the pipeline, which is believed to have caused the explosion that sent flames 50 meters into the air. Interestingly, the control room did not learn about the blast until 40 minutes later, since the alarms and communications were shut down. At the time, investigators couldn't even determine whether a bomb was also used, as the explosion incinerated any evidence. So again, just to try to highlight that hackers are no longer just focusing on data. They are now also focusing on the manipulation of assets and the manipulation of critical infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this is a slide which was shared by one of the large European multinational utilities, Enel. It's not exhaustive, but I find it an incredibly effective way to illustrate the evolution of offense and defense tactics in the industry since the 1990s. Attacks can be perpetrated by different actors, nation states, criminal groups, insiders, hacktivists, each with different motives. Most of you will be familiar with some of the offense tactics and defense tactics that you see on this slide. So viruses, spam, Trojans perhaps, phishing perhaps as well. You particularly if you have a strong or even a basic culture of cyber resilience within your organization and you receive regular reminders on cyber hygiene. One thing that I think needs to be added to this in terms of defense tactics would be situational awareness. So it's increasingly important for companies to have that type of situational awareness. Most energy companies receive thousands and thousands of attempted attacks every day. So situational awareness means that you're able to, really just focus on the very small percentage of attacks that are really threatening your critical infrastructure. One additional point is quantum computing will have the ability to take both cyber-related offense and defense tactics to the next level. Next slide, please. So what is the World Economic Forum doing about this? Back in 2018, we started our community, Systems of Cyber Resilience Electricity. This is an alliance of almost 70 public and private sector organizations, as well as universities. The private sector is represented by Chief Information Security Officers who drive the work forward. And the objective of the group is to enhance the cyber resilience of critical electricity infrastructure. So before I introduce the community, I want to briefly discuss why a specific community is required for electricity. So firstly, electricity is the ultimate real-time product, with generation and supply occurring at essentially the same time. However, due to physical constraints, achieving real-time balancing of supply and demand is quite difficult and requires intensive system coordination. A large-scale blackout driven by a sudden unexpected change to demand or supply would have socio-economic ramifications across businesses, organizations, and vital institutions. So to take an example, a 6-hour winter blackout in mainland France could result in damages costing over 1.5 billion euros. Now, traditionally managing this risk has meant dealing with issues such as component failure or inclement weather conditions via robust mitigation and recovery plans. So for the electricity industry, we have our Black Start plans, and we're good at that. We've been doing it for a long time. Today, however, existing resilience plans in electricity delivery must integrate a carefully designed cyber resilience strategy. Secondly, people around the world are dependent on secure and reliable electric power for their way of life. A significant cyber attack on multiple areas of, for example, the European grid could take down the entire European power system. An example of this cascading effect is the 2003 Italy blackout, which was a serious power outage that affected all of the Italian peninsula for 12 hours. While the initial trip was caused by overgrown vegetation, the speed of the blackout as the impact cascaded across the system was unprecedented. Additionally, if electric power were not available for weeks, months, or even a year, then these cascading effects would further degrade multiple other critical infrastructures, such as water supply, wastewater treatments, telecommunications and the internet, food production, transport, traffic controls, and so on. Thirdly, again, what is different about electricity? The electricity industry has always been complex and heavily interconnected. However, the introduction of digital technologies has really amplified the level of that interconnectivity. And here I'm talking about the integration of IT, so information technology, and OT, operational technology. And I like to think of these as IT is data and OT is assets, our physical assets, our transformers, our substations, our cables. Increasing integration of IT and OT, as well as the proliferation of IoT devices and the digitalization of business models, are improving the flexibility and maybe even the resilience of the power system, but also revealing some vulnerabilities. OT includes industrial control systems such as SCADA, EMS, and DCS. They monitor and control operational and industrial equipment, applying connectivity capabilities through IoT devices and introducing other IoT-specific solutions to legacy equipment, which was never designed to be connected to the internet, opens new threat vectors, which are not seen as much in other sectors. Next slide, please. So we needed two co-chairs for our Systems of Cyber Resilience Electricity community, co-chairs who understood the context of the electricity industry and who understood the cybersecurity landscape. Rosa Carragher is the global CISO of Iberdrola. This is a huge electricity utility active in Europe and North and South America mostly. Pierre Landgraf is the former CEO of the Swiss TSO Swissgrid, so the Swiss transmission system operator, and the current Senior Vice President of Global Security at Hitachi ABB Power Grids. Together, Rosa and Pierre Lan work with the World Economic Forum and the broader community to develop the strategic vision for this community. Next slide, please. So one priority for Pierre Lan and Rosa is being the geographical diversity of our dialogues. The community can only be unique if we have a global reach. There are already groups meeting at a national level in the US, in Europe, in China, and I'm sure around Asia. However, there are no groups that I'm aware of, like ours, who regularly bring together the electricity industry representatives from all over the world to discuss how to overcome the challenges associated with enhancing the cyber resilience of critical electricity infrastructure. As you can see, we facilitated dialogues and collaborations with many different countries, including Japan, China, Singapore, Australia, and so on. We would be delighted to invite utilities and electricity ecosystem stakeholders from the ASEAN region to join our dialogues, to join our community, and perhaps even the possibility of a collaboration with the ASEAN Centre for Energy on this topic. Next slide, please. So this is the final section, and I want to talk a little bit about the work our community has done over the past 2 years to enhance the cyber resilience of critical infrastructure. Recently, we delivered a paper to the G20, providing international, national, and organizational recommendations for enhancing cyber resilience of critical energy infrastructure. And I propose to speak briefly on those 3 sets of recommendations. So on the screen at the moment, you can see the international recommendations. And at the very highest level, our top message was more public-private dialogue and collaboration is required at the international level to enhance cyber resilience. And my colleague Harsh mentioned it as well. We really push this collaboration all the way. More public-private dialogue is needed, no matter what the topic is. More specifically on this topic, we recommended that a global compact on cybersecurity of critical energy infrastructure was needed, something along the lines of the Geneva Conventions, which established the standards of international law for humanitarian treatment in war. We believe that such a compact could consist of a set of international principles or norms establishing standards of international law for cyber or digital attacks on critical energy infrastructure. This recommendation is highly aspirational. However, it has been discussed during UN meetings and during the G7 Energy Ministerial over the past few years without making substantial progress. We have 4 sub-recommendations under this Global Compact. Number 1, the creation of an international information sharing centre addressing the international structures of many energy companies, as well as a threat landscape that knows no borders or boundaries. The centre would enable automated sharing at appropriate levels across energy ecosystem shareholders. The second recommendation, development of an international cyber mutual assistance programme. The electricity sector has a long-standing tradition of providing support to neighbouring utilities in the event of a large-scale emergency. Until now, this has been for physical events. The energy industry could also provide virtual support in the event of a serious cyber attack. Such a program already exists in the US for US utilities. Again, our recommendation takes such a program to the global level. The third recommendation, the formation of a neutral global certification body to develop a common product or certification approach, supporting energy industry stakeholders in securing their global supply chains by defining appropriate security controls for market offerings from suppliers. In fact, the European Commission is already trying to establish an EU-wide cybersecurity certifications framework through their organisation ENISA. The last recommendation, global alignment on risk-based regulatory guidances. And this is really about finding a base level alignment across the globe on cybersecurity regulations, while allowing individual nations the flexibility to tailor additional regulations to reflect their unique needs and national values. For companies operating in multiple jurisdictions, such alignment would reduce the resources, time and money spent on compliance and should promote a more risk or resilience-based approach. Next slide, please. So this slide looks at the national level, and we have 4 high-level national recommendations, again, sitting underneath a strong push for more collaboration being required between regulators and policymakers within countries, and also between different countries and different regions to share best practices on, how they have passed over challenges, what worked, what didn't work. So specifically, what do we recommend? We recommend 1, reward more open communication on incidents. We believe that incentivizing the reporting of incidents could drive a culture shift across the entire energy industry. And this feeds back into our international recommendation around the development of an international information sharing centre. The second one, encourage investments in cybersecurity. This is a challenge for all regulated utilities, how to justify investments. Investment in cybersecurity could become a separate cost and be included in the rate case. In some countries, cybersecurity investments are already treated as a fiscal asset in the regulated asset base, earning an annual return. Third, design national cybersecurity exercises, and that's about developing situational awareness from the top down, from the government level down to civilian military capabilities. Exercises should progressively include vendors, service providers, and relevant industries with dependencies on the energy industry. Existing examples include NATO's Locked Shields and the US GridX national exercises. The last recommendation is allow for the systematic capacity and skills build-up. So I'm an engineer with experience across generation and transmission electricity markets, but until 2018, I knew very little about cybersecurity. This is a common problem for utilities. And the opposite is also often true. You can find a cybersecurity professional, but it's difficult to find a cybersecurity professional with power system experience. So what could happen is national development plans should include a focus on developing a new security-centric skills base, working with the electric utilities to understand exactly what kind of skills they're looking for. Next slide, please. So the last section deals with organizational recommendations. These recommendations directly address the strategy and culture of energy industry organizations. They're designed to be actioned by boards and CEOs to drive a top-down cyber resilience culture. In 2017, we developed a set of 10 general principles for boards and CEOs of all industries. we decided that a separate set of organizational principles were required for the electricity sector. So as I mentioned, the left-hand side of this chart shows the 10 principles originally developed. These are the basics for the board and CEO of any company. And we have a report on that. If you're interested, we can share that afterwards. Now, on the right side of the chart, we have the electricity-specific principles. Enrique, could you click forward, please? And one more, that's it. The first three relate to the organization itself. Does your governance, your cybersecurity governance, incorporate IT, OT, physical security, and digital transformation? Do your efforts go beyond compliance? So taking a holistic risk management approach. Do you have a resilience by design culture? And here I want to stress, cyber risk is business risk. Do not silo your cybersecurity efforts to the IT department, as you saw in the video. It needs to be integrated with business risk and owned by all parts of the organization. In fact, one CISO, so Chief Information Security Officer, told me that he had become the main barrier to innovation in his company. Why was that? Because the innovation department didn't consult with the cybersecurity department until their product was on the way out the door to the market. So he was standing there saying no, because it didn't have the appropriate cybersecurity control. The final four, Enrique, you can flick forward again. The final four recommendations relate to the ecosystem. Your organization and how it impacts on the broader ecosystem. How the ecosystem impacts on you, how you collaborate with other stakeholders within the ecosystem, and going as far as, can you develop ecosystem-wide cyber resilience plans? Next slide, please. So a big message for us in all of this was the importance of the ecosystem. And I've said it a few times now, but it's no longer enough for you to ensure that you're protecting your own house. Leaders must realize that their organizations are part of a larger neighborhood and must work together to secure the whole neighborhood. I know this sounds daunting for an organization still trying to build a basic cybersecurity culture, but this is what the progression of the energy industry looks like, and it will be a better place. Last slide. So our work does not finish there. We continue to think about how to improve the security of the supply chain, how to better navigate the regulatory space, how to build collective situational awareness, and how to deal with emerging technologies. To go back to one of my first statements, I hope that you take a sense of urgency from this presentation. We need to act now together to ensure that our critical energy infrastructure is resilient. And I welcome anybody interested to reach out directly afterwards, and I'd be happy to introduce you to our Systems of Cyber Resilience Electricity community. Back to you, Hoyan.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so I think this is an open eye, and perhaps the organization may need to consider the cyber resilience from now on. And for participants, if you have questions for Louise, please continue to send them. And meanwhile, we will start our Q&A session, and we will start with questions that related to energy transition. So Harsh, I kind of summarize a few similar questions that asked from the participant. So the question sounds about this. So from your analysis, is there any common challenge that you found among the emerging countries in achieving their energy transition goal? And if that's so, how could these emerging countries learning from the top achievement countries? So yeah. Over to you, Harsh.
Thanks, Hoyan. So a couple of initial thoughts on that. The first challenge that emerging countries face when it comes to energy transition is to balance their economic growth from and energy transition. Emerging countries, they have an upward growth journey. They have the income standards, the population, industrialization, urbanization, all of these things are improving, which usually leads to more energy consumption. And also, now that there is increasing international trade, that means most of the emerging countries also have significant export markets overseas, and they have to operate cost effectively. So that has an implication on the kind of technologies and the use of production. So these are some of the challenges that emerging countries face. Other challenges are attraction of capital, and this applies specifically to sub-Saharan Africa. That is the need for more bankable projects for energy transition, whether it is from access or renewable energy. And when I say bankable projects, that means projects where investors can safely invest their money. That means it has solid frameworks, expected timeline of completion, manageable political and social risks, etc. And finally, there is among emerging countries is a challenge on human capital. Technology transfer has been one of the main drivers of energy transition in emerging countries, but literature suggests that countries which have higher levels of human capital are better able to use these technology transfers to develop an in-country R&D talent. So you need human capital in order to make good use of these new technologies and also possibly modify them for your country's context. So these are some challenges that we see uniform among emerging countries. And what can they learn from top performing countries? I briefly mentioned this in my presentation as well. First is on political commitment. Have long-term, stable, robust policies that can be applicable across political cycles and that look at not just supply, but different parts of the energy sector. Second, focus on energy intensity. That means pursuing, adopting advanced means of production, automation, digitalization, and adopting energy efficient alternatives. And third would be economic diversification. As emerging countries are building up their economies, that means there is an opportunity to build it right. Otherwise, once it goes to a certain path, then that creates a path dependency, and it becomes a challenge for them to pivot and pursue a different kind of a growth. Our analysis indicates that countries which have high degree of a term called economic complexity, they are much more successful in achieving energy intensity gains. Economic complexity means that they have sophisticated sectors which requires high-skilled employees and leads to value-add activities. So pivoting to those sectors, building those as an engine of your economic growth, that would provide some sort of an insurance in energy transition for emerging countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. So we have next question for Luis. So Luis, there's one participant is asking, what would be for your best suggestion for building cyber resilient of critical energy infrastructure in ASEAN? And what would be the challenges and opportunity? Over to you, Luis.
Sure, thanks. So I would say start at the organizational level. So start within your own company, and you need to start by building a culture and strategy around cyber resilience. And I specifically say cyber resilience instead of cyber security. You're never going to be 100% secure, so you need to focus on resilience. How can you rebound, or how can you handle cyber attacks? We have, as I mentioned, 10 basic principles, which is really the starting point. They were developed by global collaboration group of stakeholders in collaboration with each other. You could use that as a starting point. And then we have the following 7 principles specifically dedicated to the electricity industry. And many of the largest electricity companies in the world have been looking at these principles and seeing how their existing strategies align with these principles. So that could be a starting point. On that, you need to be thinking about how do you go beyond compliance? So how do you go really towards secure, resilient, critical infrastructure system? And if I was to think of one of the challenges, I would think investment. Where do you get the investment from? How do you justify investment into cybersecurity related topics? And that is, let me turn it into an opportunity to build a better relationship with your regulators, your policymakers on this topic, to build some trust between all of you on working together and collaborating on really building resilience of your critical energy infrastructure. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm not going to go into any more detail, but again, I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. Feel free to reach out, and I'm also happy to put you in contact with some of our community members who would be glad to discuss this in more detail with you.
Thank you, Luis. And we apologize for because of the time constraint, we cannot take any more questions. But we see that because there are still a lot of questions that very interesting. So in case you really have the question that you really need the answer, just send us an email and we will coordinate on behalf. So ladies and gentlemen, so we have now reached the end of the sharing session. So once again, I would like to thank our delegate from the World Economic Forum for their insightful presentation and discussion. So we have learned a lot from you. And I also would like to thank all the participants for joining us today. And my gratitude also go to our colleagues and friends who helped us in organizing and disseminating this event. And last but not least, so please also allow me to share with you our next sharing session. We will have Professor Joy Pereira. She's a professor from the University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and her presentation topic for the next session will be climate risk and adaptation for 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming in Southeast Asia. She's also the vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 2. So we're really looking forward to see you again on 24th July. So before we end, just a kind reminder. So in a minute, you will probably receive a link that link to the post webinar survey. So please help us to fill in, then we can improve ourselves. So so maybe that's all for today. And once again, thank you for our delegate and all the participants for your support and your time. So perhaps I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye.